Welcome to the Startup Grind.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Startup Grind San Antonio. And glad you all can make it here tonight. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Geekdom, for giving us this space and allowing us to all meet and talk about entrepreneurship. And we'd especially like to stand up and give a Startup Grind welcome to Robyn Metcalfe for joining us this evening. Okay, Bob really doesn't need an introduction because he is an internet pioneer, but I will do a brief introduction of him. He's the Professor of Innovation and the Murchison Fellow of Free Enterprise at the University of Texas at Austin. For the last, and he's got the orange Longhorn orange Converses on to show for it. He has also taught an undergraduate course on entrepreneurship used to be called One Semester Startup, but now it's called Longhorn Startup, right? And you've taught that for the past couple of years. You were also inducted to the Internet Hall of Fame this past summer for inventing Ethernet, a local area networking technology that lets computers communicate with one another, which is probably the layman's version of Ethernet that I can understand. And you also...
Did you write that?
Did I write that?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Okay. I'm not publishing this anywhere, all right? Metcalfe also co-founded 3Com and served as publisher and pundit at InfoWorld. He worked as a full-time venture capitalist for a decade as a partner at Polaris Ventures in Boston. He has also climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. His wife runs ultra marathons and is also in charge of the food lab at UT Austin. And both of your children just qualified for the Boston Marathon. And they've again, they've run it before. They ran it last year?
No.
Okay.
Luckily skipped last year.
But they have run it previously. And you just completed your first triathlon last year.
I did.
Yes. So, all right. So we'll get right into it. You were born in Brooklyn, New York, and
in 1946. Yes. So I'm the leading edge of the baby boom. There's a lot of guys right behind me.
So when did you first know that you were an entrepreneur? When did that first bubble up to the surface? When you were a kid? Were you entrepreneurial?
I had a brush with it. My father started a company. My father was a lifelong union member. I never went to college, a union technician guy. But there was this aberration in my youth. He started a company called BAM Electronics, and its purpose was to service this new technology that had just arrived called television. And his company, BAM, which stood for Bailey, Abramson, and Metcalfe, repaired televisions, mostly by taking the tubes and testing them one by one and then replacing the broken one. And the company lasted a year, and Bailey, Abramson, and Metcalfe ended up hating each other because they all thought, each one thought he was working harder than the other two. So the company went boom. So that was an early brush with entrepreneurship, not entirely a positive one. Although it did lead to my interest in digital electronics. Because one day my dad came home from work and found me unconscious on the basement floor. I had reached into one of his broken televisions and found the high voltage line into the CRT, and it knocked me out. And on that day I resolved never to go above 5 volts.
So I was going to ask you, what kind of toys did you play with? Did you have Rector sets and Legos and that kind of thing when you were a kid?
Not Legos, but Rector sets and trains, electric trains. And that's important because my dad brought home all the doodads for the train set, which I'm sure captivating to all of you, but there was Masonite and neon lights and toggle switches and relays all came from work. And we used those to build a train routing system on this big 4x8 piece of plywood, which was painted green, of course, in the basement. But in 8th grade, I needed a science project, so I decided to build a computer. So I used the exact same materials, the masonite, the neon bulbs, the toggle switches, and the relays to build a device that would add any number between 1 and 3 to any other number between 1 and 3 and display the sum as by lighting one of the lights, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And my teacher called it, my 8th grade teacher, Mr. Gosier, called it a computer. And I think that's how I got into the computer business, through trains. So it goes through, it's funny things, the way your life evolves, through trains to this this computer that I built. Haha.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask you, if you had an influential teacher, if you had somebody who inspired you when you were young to pursue that, if that teacher was the one, or...
So I got inducted into the Bayshore High School Hall of Fame a few years ago, and I went back to Bayshore, Long Island for the honor. And they asked each of the inductees to give a 1-minute acceptance speech. So I gave the answer to your question about how my entire life had been changed by this one great teacher, Mr. Gosier, my 8th grade science teacher, and how grateful I was. And everyone in the rooms started looking over, like to the side. And there, in a wheelchair, was Mr. Gosier. I'm about to cry now. It was such a moment.
Oh, that's great.
And this was many, as you can imagine, many years later, closing the loop with Mr. Gosier.
That is fantastic. 'Cause
I even know the grade he gave me on that project, by the way.
what was it?
A triple plus H superior. So if that doesn't motivate you to do bigger and better things. Been trying to beat that grade ever since.
That would be hard. Almost, you can't go beyond that.
I imagine what he did is he graded mine last. So he started out and it was sort of a mediocre project and he gave the kid an A. And then there was a slightly better one, so he gave the kid an A+. By the time he got to me, he had escalated. So he had no choice but to give me the triple plus H superior.
That's a great story. And you graduated second in your high school.
Well, thanks for reminding me. I still have
So
it.
you know who was first?
Yeah, Ron Rosenbaum was first.
Did
Ron
you see him at the reunion?
No, he didn't.
Oh.
He got inducted to the Hall of Fame a different year from me.
Oh, okay.
But he cheated. His mom was head of the English department at my high school. So when I'm sure he cheated me out of that. But he went to Yale and he got all the humanities type awards at graduation. But I got all the math, science, physics, chemistry awards. And guess which ones had the most money associated with it? So I cleaned up math and chemistry. He got this English award and the Russian award. Piddling little amounts of money.
You're not doing very well for our humanities right now. All these people watching this they should be pursuing STEM degrees.
Well, Ron is a famous writer. He worked for the Village Voice for many years, so he lives in New York, and he started tweeting recently. So now we are connected because we tweet at each other. Occasionally he tweets something that I understand, and then I'll retweet it. He's into literature, and today he tweeted about F. Scott Fitzgerald. And J.D. Salinger is another one of his specialties.
That's great. And you received your bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from MIT, and then you decided to get a master's degree in applied mathematics.
You skipped a degree.
I did?
I did.
Oh, okay.
So my end of my 4th year was coming at MIT, and the twists and turns, I was going to graduate with a degree in industrial management. My father took me aside and said, "We did not send you to MIT to get a degree in management." So I stayed a 5th year and I got an electrical engineering degree, but just to keep my father happy. But then I went up the river and got that applied math degree.
So why did you go to Harvard? Why didn't you just stay at MIT and get and then you go on to get a PhD in computer science?
Well, where were you when I needed you?
Because you had a hard time at Harvard, right?
I decided that I'd been at MIT for 5 years, so a change of scenery, I would go somewhere else. And I applied a bunch of places, and Harvard let me in, so I decided to go there. It was a mistake, because I'm an engineer. And Harvard, to this day, does not like engineers. They recently named their new School of Engineering. I say recently, 10 years ago. And I'm now a retro alum of this Harvard School of Engineering. But they couldn't call it the School of Engineering. That latent hostility to engineers. It's called the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. That's because engineering is just a little too low status. They had to tack on the applied sciences at the end to kind of lift it up in their eyes. Anyway, it was a horrible mistake, and I had a bad run-in with Harvard.
Yeah. But you ended up getting your PhD and all as well. And that was something that you were talking to Dr. T, the guy who founded National Instruments at University of Texas, about whether you should go on and get a PhD and found a company, which you both did, or whether you should drop out and go the Michael Dell route, or the other people like Bill Gates and I don't know, there's a few. So what's your advice on pursuing the higher education?
Most companies, successful companies, are founded by people over 40. I was 33. There are these damn counterexamples, however. Gates, Jobs, Zuckerberg, Dell, Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid, dropped out of Harvard. So there are these few dropouts that ruin everything, because our students at UT, they want to be the next Zuckerberg, and it's not up to me to rain on their parade, so I encourage them, but they're not very likely to succeed. Not very likely to succeed. Now I've done it. Yeah, we're going to have a Zuckerberg come out of this year's class, and then I'll look bad. But we're encouraging students to start companies, to learn how to operate the machinery of free enterprise, as I like to put it. And if this company isn't successful, 3Com was my fourth attempt. So I started two consulting companies and a software company in college. I was on the startup team, and so 3Com, which really took off, was my fourth try. So maybe our students, if they don't make it this try, maybe they'll make it on their second or third or fourth try.
And I missed the MIT reference, but you were the captain of your tennis team at MIT.
I was.
So do you still play tennis? And what role do you think sports played in the competitive nature of entrepreneurship?
I don't play tennis very often anymore. And by the way, I just learned that Trinity is here in San Antonio. When I was growing up, Trinity was the tennis power. It beat SC, beat UCLA, beat Stanford, beat all those people. Are there Trinity people here tonight?
I think so.
Yeah. We have tennis in common. Anyway, I played a lot of tennis in high school and then college, and then a little after college. And I'm a big sports fan. I don't play, and I hate to watch tennis, because when I watch tennis, then it makes me want to play. I don't like watching, especially since they're so good. I need to get back to. I need to drop about 30 pounds, and then I'll go back and play tennis.
Well, do you think that competitive spirit that tennis and sports fosters helps in entrepreneurship?
Yes. Well, not only the competitiveness. When you play tournament tennis, I played intercollegiate tennis and then tournament tennis, but not the pro. I never gave up my amateur status. But I played a lot of competitive, and you learn something about competitiveness by playing tennis in a tournament. You learn how you can win. It's a mental thing, and so winning is a mental thing. So I used to love it when my opponents would win the warm-up. Let them win the warm-up, and then come back in the third set. And it's a funny thing, everybody I ever beat always told me they were having a bad day. Oh, but I'm sorry, and the other thing you learn is discipline. So not just competitiveness, but discipline and the rewards of discipline, which is why I've been playing with a word which is very common, and I bet you use it here a lot: passion. Have you heard it said that when you start a company, you need to pursue your passion? And I've been working on that word because I'm trying to figure out how to teach entrepreneurship better. And I don't think I'm beginning to think that passion is not the right word. So I'm wavering between ambition and striving, which are sort of synonyms for passion. But it also comes from tennis, because your response to circumstances in a tennis match, passion is not quite the right word, because there's a lot of passionate tennis players. When they make a bad shot, their next shot's even worse, because they get upset and they throw their rackets. That's a favorite thing for immature tennis players to do. But if your reaction, your response to the evolution of events is disciplined, and then it relates more to competitiveness and ambition and control, then a bad shot can motivate you to do better next time instead of worse next time. And I found that important, is sort of, so discipline and competitiveness, and then gamesmanship, letting them win the warm-up is a standard gamesmanship thing. Especially these young preppy tennis. I learned how to play tennis on the public courts, which were asphalt. And I played a lot of these really good preppy players who learned on grass or clay. And I used to really enjoy beating them, especially.
So maybe perseverance is part of that?
Yes, perseverance. But help me with this, the word passion. I'm struggling with passion, ambition, striving. Ambition seems to have more discipline in it than passion does. And there are, after all, crimes of passion. And I've watched passion destroy companies. And I've watched passion destroy people. So maybe I like ambition better than passion as the word. Striving's not a bad word either.
You can tell you're a journalist or you're a word person, you're a writer, because you care about words and their meanings.
I do.
Specific. So in 1972, and I didn't write this either, you began working at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which they call Xerox Park. And you met D.R. Boggs.
David
Boggs with an S? Okay, yeah. Boggs. And with Boggs, you invented what has come to be known as the Ethernet, the local area network technology that turns PCs into communication tools by linking them together.
I didn't write that either, but it certainly does that.
So where did you have your aha moment, and when did you know you had something that was patentable and was something that you could form a company around?
Well, there's a bunch of aha moments, but the big event was being the luckiest guy on earth. Now, I am the luckiest guy on earth. The first time I was lucky is I happened to be born to my parents, so I was very lucky there. The second luck goes to your question. I was the first guy on earth to be given the problem of networking a building full of personal computers. Now, you take for granted that every building is full of personal computers, but in 1973, it was not true. Not even Data Point had buildings full of personal computers in 1973. As I recall, since this is San Antonio, ArcNet was 76. So I was pretty early. So we were going to put a computer on every desk. Actually, it was going to be under the desk. It was too big to put on the desk. But we made it exactly the right height to fit under the furniture we had. And then there would be this, imagine this, a bitmap display, so you could put fonts and things on it, with windows and a mouse you could select, all of which was new. And then they turned to me and they said, build a network for this. Now, how lucky can you get to get that problem? That was. So then I took a bunch of ideas from the ARPANET, the early internet, packet switching, and some ideas from the Aloha Packet Radio Network at the University of Hawaii, and combined those two to produce Ethernet that was a long piece of coaxial cable, which we called the ether, into which the many PCs and their servers would tap, literally tap, and then they would inject data packets a bit at a time at 2.94 megabits per second, and those packets had an address in the header, and all the PCs were watching the cable, and when they saw a packet go by, they would look for their address, and if it was their address, they would copy it into memory, and if it wasn't, they would just ignore it. And that was the first Ethernet.
Wow. And so did you leave right after? Did you license the technology from Park, or how did that work, or did you own it?
Oh, no. So there are 4 patents that I think of as Ethernet patents, all of which are, my name is on them in various combinations. And they're all owned by Xerox Corporation. By now, they're all expired, so don't worry about that. And they were owned by Xerox Corporation that paid us to do all this work. And then David Boggs and I and others spent the next 8 years building an internet inside of Xerox. So Xerox had a worldwide internet with routers and not TCP/IP, but a packet protocol. And then in 1979, so that's invented in 73, left in 79. I left in January of 79 as a consultant. So here's one of those aha moments. Consultant to a man named Gordon Bell, who was then Vice President of Engineering of Digital Equipment Corporation, which at the time was the world's second largest computer company. And Gordon was a big fan of Ethernet, and he wanted me as a consultant to design a new network for him that was like Ethernet, so he could connect all of his personal computers with a LAN. And I said, Gordon, I can't do that really. First of all, because I've been at Xerox for 8 years, I feel kind of loyal. I wouldn't feel right. And two, I just finished designing the best possible network that I could think of. If I did another one, it wouldn't be as good as the original. So in that meeting, we decided, and neither one of us can remember whose idea it was, to say, well, why don't we just propose to Xerox that we work together on a standard network? And that way DEC can just use Ethernet instead of designing its own. And then a couple months later, I ran into Intel Corporation that was had a new chip technology looking for a standard to implement, and we lured Intel to do the chip. So those three companies, DEC, Intel, Xerox, became known as DIX, D-I-X, developed an Ethernet standard together and submitted it. We created a committee of the IEEE called 802, Project 802, no dots, Project 802. And we created it to make Ethernet a standard. And so then on September 30th of 1980, DIX submitted a Blue Book specification for Ethernet, submitted it to the IEEE, thereby setting off what I call the LAN wars, which then lasted another 20 years or so, and involved data point, I might add. So then, hey, does anyone remember Data Point? Because I remember Data Point, and it was a San Antonio company. It was a couple of people. In 1980, we're creating 802, Project 802 of the IEEE in order to standardize a LAN. Guess what was the most widely installed LAN in the world at that particular time? ArcNet from DataPoint, who had begun shipping, I think, roughly in 1976. So by 79, 80, they had, they must have had tens of thousands of them out there. Huge install base. So I was designated to call up a man named Victor Poor, who was the VP of Engineering of DataPoint, and ask him if he would submit ArcNet to IEEE 802 as a proposed standard. And Victor Poor said, I have a board meeting coming up in a week. I'll call you back after the board meeting. Time passed. He calls back 2 weeks later. It says, we had the board meeting and we've decided to keep ArcNet proprietary to DataPoint Corporation. End of ArcNet. Actually, it wasn't the end of ArcNet. ArcNet, you can buy it today, actually, but it really hung on a long time. It was kind of annoying. It was always cheaper and sort of grittier, and the open source people always liked ArcNet better than Ethernet for some reason. But the real two killers were two major corporations, General Motors and IBM, which are both different companies today than they were then. But both of them were annoyed that a company other than they had submitted a standard for local area networking. They didn't know what local area networking was, but they had a hunch that they should be specifying the standard. So IBM submitted its IBM Token Ring, and General Motors submitted its General Motors Token Bus. And so the three, with ArcNet's out here selling, but the three of us are in the IEEE just fighting over who's going to be the standard. Then the IEEE did a courageous thing. After 2 years, decided to standardize all three. Ethernet 802.3, that's where the dots came from, 802.3, Ethernet 802.4 token bus, and 802.5 token ring. Token bus died a couple years later, but token ring hung on because it had the IBM Corporation behind it. It hung on for, 20 years, during which I lived under a cloud. My own company made me ship IBM Token Ring because, Bob, we're not going to let your passionate commitment to Ethernet destroy this company. This is a connectivity company, so this company has to offer token ring too, which will eventually be the standard because it's backed by the IBM Corporation, which has 90% market share in computing. So we beat IBM to market with the IBM token ring, and then IBM came to market right behind us, and they sold 95% of the token ring thereafter because their token ring was special. It was 802.5 plus some special SNA dust. SNA was the name of their network architecture, and they sprinkled SNA dust over their token ring. Our token ring didn't have that SNA dust, so we had a really hard time selling into the IBM market. And then ultimately, Ethernet killed the token ring. And, I'm really happy about that.
And you just did a Ask Me Anything on Reddit, where a lot of networking people were asking you these very specific questions about token ring, and they were happy to hear that it had died and yours had prevailed. So, well,
yeah, but let me tell you a consequence of that. So let's say just for 10 years, every day, my wife, my children, people I worked with, my board of directors, my customers told me every single day that you are doomed, that the IBM token ring is going to win, and IBM is going to sell it, not you, for 10 years, roughly. But we pushed on forward, and ultimately, as you probably guess, Ethernet won. So now, do you think I'm very good at taking advice from people? Nah, it paid off. Ignoring all that advice for 10 years paid off for me, so I don't take any input whatsoever.
Well, that goes to one of my next questions is you formed 3Com, and did you bootstrap it initially? How did you get the money to form 3Com? And then you went out and looked for venture capital, and how did you raise the venture capital?
Well, 3Com, while I was thinking of starting 3Com, I got involved in a lawsuit. I bought a house, and the real estate agent sold it to somebody else. So I sued him, and it was bloody and horrible, but after 2 years, I received a check for $27,000. And that was my grub stake. Is that the right word, grub stake? You know, gold miners, what's that, grub stake? Anyway, that was I put that money into 3Com. Actually, I didn't put it all into 3Com directly because I tried to recruit 3 other founders. So we had a dinner at the Bella Vista restaurant in Woodside, California, overlooking Silicon Valley, and I laid out to my proposed co-founders that we should start a company, that it should connect things together, computer, communication, compatibility, 3Com, and I'm going to own 51%, and John, you're going to own 18%, and Greg, you're going to own 18%, and Ron, you're going to own 12, whatever the numbers, on a napkin, which is the thing you do. You should always start a company with a napkin. And right away, John said, no. Ron said, I got this project at Xerox that I really need to finish, so how about I come back in a year? And Greg said, sign me up, coach, I'm in. So of the $27,000, I had to lend $3,000 to Greg so that he could put it into the company and own his share. And he promised to pay me back in 10 months at $300 a month. So my $3,000 is lent to him. He puts it into the company, which then pays his salary so that he can repay the debt to me. This is really bad financial engineering. I think we could have done it better than that. But the $27,000 from that settlement on the real estate lawsuit was the beginning of the company. Then we started consulting. The personal computer industry was new, and local networking was new, and we were experts in it, so we got consulting gigs and were profitable, day one doing these. And then we convinced a customer called Exxon Enterprises. It was a branch of the Exxon Oil Company, which perhaps you've heard of, which in those days was starting to diversify by going into office systems, by starting a bunch of startups in Silicon Valley. And they decided they wanted to buy an Ethernet, a 10 megabit per second Ethernet transceiver, and we don't have those anymore, a Ethernet card for the DEC VAX computer, an Ethernet card for the DEC Micro 11, a QBus card for the Micro 11, and an implementation of this new government protocol called TCP/IP for Unix. And they agreed to pay us $750,000 to develop those 4 products, and then we would deliver them to them, and they would have a worldwide, perpetual, non-exclusive license to do whatever they wanted with those products in return for $750,000. So then a few months passed, and we ended up with 4 products. It all worked. We gave them to Exxon, and then we turned to the venture community. Because what had happened by then is that other people had started land companies, and they seemed to be taking off. We were bootstrapping. We were not taking. We were growing, but we weren't like this. So we got. We woke up and said we better put some gas in the tank and step on the accelerator. So we went out to raise venture capital with these 4 products. And what do you think the VCs said? You idiot. You just licensed your 4 products to the world's largest company. How can you possibly compete with them? To which the answer was, they're an oil company. They will never compete with us. They have the right to, but they're just never going to do it. And fortunately, I got 3 of the best VCs. 97 VCs walked, but 3 didn't. And they happened to be among the best ones, so I lucked out. So I sold a third of the company for $1.1 million. And then a year later, we doubled our valuation and sold $2.2 million worth of stock. And then a year later, we doubled the valuation again, and we sold $4.4 million worth of stock. And then a year later, we went public. We raised $11 million. And then the year after that, we did a secondary offering and raised $25 million. So that was the financing history of the company.
And I've heard you say before in Austin, because some people think that taking a company public is the big exit, and you get, collect your money and that you've made it. But you said that's just an event in the life cycle of a company. It's not the event.
Well, I'm not a big fan of IPOs because they immediately turn all of your employees into stockbrokers. And a lot of stupid things get said about IPOs. So, for example, one stupid thing was, Mark Zuckerberg made $12 billion today. No. His stock finally got valued by the public, whatever the number was, on that day. But he didn't make the $12 billion on that day. It just got valued. And the other stupid thing is VCs and others refer to this as an exit. So they all exit, but you have a company, and there it is, and it's full of people, and it's got customers and stuff, and it's humming along, and you're not exiting. So I object to that word. I prefer the word liquidity event for certain. Well, the employees get everyone gets liquidity, including the employees on their stock options. So I prefer liquidity event to exit.
And I've also heard you talk about the importance of sales in the entrepreneurial process. A lot of engineers not look as highly upon the sales people in their corporation, but at 3Com you worked as head of sales and marketing and increased sales from 0 to $1 million in a month. So how did you do that? And also, is that where you came up with Metcalfe's Law? Because I thought those two were tied together.
You've been doing a lot of reading.
See, I did my research.
Yeah. The nerds in the suits. Nerd is a word that suits use to make fun of nerds. And suits is a word that nerds use to make fun of suits. And the fact is that at least in my company and many of the companies I've seen, in order to be successful, you need both nerds and suits, and they better respect each other or you're doomed. So a nerd-only company or a suit-only company, those are not good companies. You need grand unification of the nerds and the suits. And as I'm fond of saying, they are different life forms. but they're carbon-based. So there is some basis that, linking them together. So my company was burning through its cash like this. And the board of directors met because I had misestimated, it turned out by 6 months, the takeoff of Ethernet. So while I was being wrong, the cash was going like this. So the board met and decided that my partner, Bill Krause, should be the CEO instead of me. Oh, God, did that hurt. And then a measure of our desperation is they appointed me head of sales and marketing. And that's the period, it took me a while to go from 0 to $1 million a month. And it was something that I could do because at that time it was personal selling. And I had invented the thing, so I could get a meeting with anybody on that basis. And I went to a lot of meetings. But after getting to $1 million a month, then the job had gotten too technical for me. That is, sales technical. So I had 6 regional managers by that time that I had carefully recruited with the help of experts. But they needed compensation plans and activity management and territory management and contracts and knowledge of international distributorships. These are all technologies, sales technologies, that it was best to leave to experts. So we did, and this is one of my favorite metaphors, we shifted gears. And in came Mike Haliburka, VP Sales. Mike took us from $1 million a month to $5 million a month, and then he redlined. And we shifted again, and in came Chuck Kempton. And Chuck took us from 5 to 25, and then guess what happened? He redlined. So we brought in Bob Finocchio, and he took us all the way to billions. And the gear shift, you know, all of those people, including me, had succeeded in that job, but we had succeeded so much the company outgrew us, grew more rapidly than we could keep up. So the company wisely shifted gears a few times. And that's an important concept in a rapidly growing company, is the ability to shift gears. In big companies, the people grow faster than the company, and they get promoted. But in a rapidly growing high-tech company, the company's growing faster than the people. So you need to be able to shift gears, and it sometimes involves changing people. And the hard part about that is self-awareness. Self-awareness is very hard. Very seldom does someone say, I've redlined, I need somebody else to do my job now. I'm sorry, I just don't know how to do channel conflict in an international context with a multi-divisional corporation. Please put somebody in who knows how to do that. No one, I'll never say never, but rarely does anybody volunteer to be replaced in their job because they've been outgrown. So that requires, you can't rely on self-awareness, you have to rely on governance. So the board has to be able to choose the best CEO, and the CEO needs to be able to choose the best VP of sales from time to time, and not relying on self-awareness. If you want to learn a lesson in self-awareness, walk across UT Austin campus. You'll see students coming at you, and you know, that kid does not own a mirror. That kid owned a mirror, he wouldn't look like that. The fact is, he probably has a mirror, and he looks in the mirror, and he doesn't see what I see. So that's a plea for in the design of your companies. You've got to get the governance right. It's not a party, and then you need to be firing on all cylinders at all times, which does require that you shift gears now and then, as happened in this 3Com sales scenario.
And Metcalfe's law, which I'm not reading this. It is the value of a network is directly proportional to the square of the number of people in a network, which means that a network is more valuable the more people that are using it, right?
Right. Okay, so this is a story in sales tools. We're selling Ethernet. Well, you have to imagine PCs didn't used to have networking. So what you'd do is you'd have a printed circuit card that you would plug into the PC to put it on the Ethernet to connect it to the cable. We sold those cards. First ones we sold were $5,000 each. And then when the IBM PC came out, we were selling them for under $1,000. And our salesmen were all former mini computer salesmen, and they like to make the commission on a $30,000 sale. which meant they were out there trying to sell 30 cards at a time to people with 30 PCs. And we went out and tried that, and it did not work because PCs were new and people didn't know what they were exactly, and they didn't know why they would need to network them. So they weren't going to drop 30 grand on something they never heard of. So we went into a trance and we came up with a 3-node starter kit for $3,000. You get 3 cards and a diskette with software on it. So you could share a printer, share a disk, exchange email among the 3 PCs, connect terminal to a mini computer, make them all into terminals on a mini computer, or write programs that use, it was PFMTS, and the S was stubs. Today we use the word API, so there was an API. And that was on the diskette. We sold these trial kits for $3,000, and that $3,000 is a lot less than 30, and it was below a lot of approval thresholds, so we started selling these kits. Of course, not very much. So the salesmen were unhappy because they weren't getting very much commission on those. But the sales cycle suddenly went from infinity to a week, so you could sell them. So we sold a bunch, and then we went back to sell the 30. Now that you've tried it, we'd like you to buy 30 now. And the customers said the following. They said, this kit did exactly what you said it would, and it's not useful. Apparently sending email among 3 people is not really useful. And but I knew, since I had worked at the Xerox Research Center and had built an internet with Ethernets everywhere, all through Xerox Corporation, I knew that Ethernet was useful. I just had to figure out how to explain it in this situation. So I went into a trance and came up with a slide. When I say slide, by the way, it was literally a 35mm slide. PowerPoint wasn't until I was on the board of the company that developed PowerPoint. We sold it to Microsoft in 1987 for $14 million. That was 1987. This is 1980. So it was a slide, 35mm slide, and it basically said the size of the network grows linearly. You pay $1,000 a node or whatever the price is. But the number of possible connections in that network goes up as n times n minus 1. That is, each node in the network can connect to n minus 1 other nodes. So the total number of connections of the network is n times n minus 1, which is approximately n squared. So there's this curve, quadratic. And you'll note the quadratic always overtakes the linear. Out here, there's a point of crossover where the quadratic overtakes the linear. And that's called the critical mass point. So I sent my little sales force out with that slide to explain to customers that the reason that their networks were not useful is they were too small. And they needed to achieve critical mass. And to do that, they would have to buy, say, 30 cards from our salesmen. And they believed us. And they bought the 30s. And it turned out their networks were useful. Because 30 is a lot bigger than 3. And the way I know that is that we went public shortly thereafter in March of 1984. We were selling thousands of these cards per month, ultimately got to millions of them per month. And Ethernet has proven useful, according to Metcalfe's law. Now, professors, many professors for the last 25 years, by the way, I didn't call it Metcalfe's law. It was called the slide, which you can get on the net. There's the systemic value slide. Later, this was by George Gilder in 1995. It was called Metcalfe's law. And I've been defending it against professors ever since, who have noticed that quadratic goes to infinity. And they have a hunch, we all have a hunch, that maybe the value of a network does not go to infinity, that maybe there's some diminishing returns. And I'm sticking by my story. It's a vision thing.
All right. So, and you also wrote a paper on invention as a flower and innovation as a weed, which I found really interesting because when you're talking about the inventive process of just creating something that's never been done before, how it's magical, it's wonderful. And then, but the innovation process, like you talked about, selling something to somebody, fighting them for 10 years to adopt your technology. That's the innovation process.
Yeah, so this flower is, the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, California. Infinite budgets, no meeting, one meeting a week, Tuesday at noon, which was really hard. After a while, I got to be hard showing up every Tuesday at noon. Wow. And so invention was a flower. It was a beautiful thing. Then you go out into the world, and you all here in Geekdom celebrate innovation and how exciting it is and everything. But there's this thing out there called the status quo, and you try to innovate on it, and it doesn't like it. Innovation's fine for other people, but don't you innovate on me. And that's where this weed thing comes, because then your innovation has to be a weed. It has to be resilient. And we had this expression in the selling of networks of personal computers were a new thing in the 80s. Most of the people buying computers in those days had mini computers and mainframes that they bought from IBM and DEC. So we had to convince them to use PCs and then to network them together. It was a very hard sell. And IBM was there with, Token Ring wasn't important to them. They were selling mainframe computers, and they owned the buyers of all the major corporations. So we were weeds. And we used to joke, and it wasn't entirely a joke, that our business would take off when all of those IBM CIOs died, because they weren't going to change their mind and they weren't going to change their buying patterns. We had to wait for them to die or retire. It turned out we were more impatient. We couldn't wait that long. So what we did is we decided not to sell to them, but to sell to somebody else. And so we sold to a mythical character called the Work Group IT Network Manager, who did not exist. So we started training them. So we had, it's called, Steve Jobs invented it, but it's called evangelism. Apple, you remember Guy Kawasaki as the Apple evangelist. Well, we copied Guy, and we started evangelizing to these people who weren't the IBM CIO buying mainframes. These were people who were sneaking PCs into their companies underneath the radar and then networking them. So those people, they were much easier to convince than these big guys. So we waiting for them to die, but in the meantime, selling to somebody else.
Well, how do you concoct a pesticide then to keep the weed from just being stomped down? I mean, what was the best defense in maintaining your resilience when everything was telling you that the competition was telling you that IBM was going to be the standard? I mean, what kept you from just saying, okay, I mean, don't you think that happens with a lot of patent holders? They develop these great inventions and they just don't endure the process of innovation?
Well, the bad news is the status quo is mostly right. That is, most new ideas are not good. And the status quo is right to kill them. That's really bad news when you're passionate about one of those. But the way we won, two ways. One is we were part of a bigger movement. That is, we weren't just introducing LANs, personal computers, and spreadsheets, and the internet, and word processing, and PowerPoint, and we're all coming together. And they all needed each other. It was a package. So we were part of a package. If we were the only arrow, it would have been tough going, but we were showing up. We had Steve Jobs on our side. We even had IBM on our side. Eventually, they were selling PCs that needed to be networked. So 3Com built its business on networking IBM PCs using Ethernet instead of IBM Token Ring. So we did that. The other secret was, and it's hard to convince you all today about this, but in those days, an open standard was novel. So the IBM had SNA, which I like to call SNA, just to annoy them. And then DEC had DECnet, and Wang had WangNet, and DataPoint had ArcNet, and everybody had their own net. And this notion of a TCP/IP packet standard for the internet was new. It wasn't until TCP/IP standard came out in a series of green books in December of 1979. 3Com Corporation was the first company to implement it commercially. And we positioned Ethernet and 3Com and TCP/IP as open standards. Hence the name of our company, 3Com, Computer Communication Compatibility. So we were peddling standards. That was the secret weapon. So that's what eventually beat IBM. Because IBM was used to making its own standards, SNA, and we were there, and the customers loved the idea of an open standard because it would enhance connectivity, enable competition among alternate suppliers. It was a win-win-win-win-win for customers. And that's how we eventually overpowered IBM.
Well, one of the things that you talked about before is entrepreneurs. You ran several companies starting in college, and the ability to know when to quit doing that and to move on to something else. When does somebody know, and is it that other people from the outside, because people from the outside were telling you to quit, but you didn't listen to them. So I'm trying to figure out, how do you know as an entrepreneur what you're doing, it's time to call it quits and move on to something else?
So I retired from 3Com in 1990. It was a new headquarters had just been built. I never occupied the new headquarters. I retired the day they opened it. And they put a big boulder with a bronze plaque on it with a picture of me and then a saying. And the saying relates to your question. Of all the things I said for years and years and years, they chose this one thing to put on my damn plaque. And the only difference between someone who's stubborn and someone who's a visionary is whether they're right or not. Why did they choose that? No, they could have chosen another thing. So it's a hard question. When do you persevere, right? Didn't we agree perseverance is a good thing? So do you persevere? Does the captain go down with the ship? Do you go off the end of the earth because it's your thing and you're going to persevere? Or do you wisely, of course the other extreme is to be a little too opportunistic. So there are people, it's a character flaw. People are constantly jumping to what looks like a slightly better situation to the one they're currently in. And you can tell from their resumes because they only stay at a company like a year or two and then they bolt. And I don't recruit people like that. So I prefer stubborn, perseverant people as opposed to opportunistic rats deserting the sinking ship. So I won't. So my personality type is I would not be the rat deserting the sinking ship. But you can overdo that.
And in that Discovery series, it's a Discovery Channel. There's a fascinating 50 questions with Bob Metcalfe online, and you can Google it and find out. It's under Curiosity, and they asked you if it was okay to fail in that series, and you had a great answer about.
What was it?
You said, yeah, it was okay, but you didn't want to see like somebody who was a total failure with all this stuff.
Well, it's just a standard. You must have heard it in these halls. How it's good. It's okay to fail. It's not the end of the earth. And in fact, you have to fail to innovate. If you're not failing at least a little bit, it means you're not really innovating. You're not trying hard enough, and that's all true. On the other hand, you learn much more from success than you learn from failure. Because there are so many ways, there are so many more ways to fail than there are to succeed. So if you succeed, you should pay attention to what you did right, because there's a lot of learning in that, much more than 97 mistakes you made when you go wrong. Anyway, yeah, you need to fail. Oh, there's two kinds of failures, two kinds of mistakes you don't want to make. Let me see if I can remember. You don't want to make boring mistakes. So you need to find out what mistakes were made before you got there and don't do that again. That's just boring. So make new mistakes. And then as you've heard from the lean, you must have all heard about the lean machine method of startups. They make it down here to San Antonio?
Yeah, you mean lean startup? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, a little.
Fail quickly. You've heard that, right? Have you all heard fail quickly?
No.
It's awfully good advice. Yeah. Fail quickly, and that's true. You want to get on with it. So if you try an experiment and then the result is negative, that's probably a time to reconsider and as I'm sure you say, pivot. We're going to pivot, or arabesque is the more beautiful form of that. So that's a little bit like admitting failure and recovering.
I'm going to ask you some questions about just this area now, because the big thing is you've said that you want Austin to be a better Silicon Valley, and then you consider San Antonio to be a suburb, and Houston and Dallas.
We have 4 suburbs of Austin. To the north, we have Dallas. To the east, we have Houston. To the south, we have San Antonio. And to the west, we have El Paso. I'm new to Texas. That's my view of Texas. So when I say make Austin a better Silicon Valley, I include the 4 suburbs.
And do you think there's this big controversy in this region about whether people are thinking big enough, whether they're coming up with the ideas that are going to be the innovations that change the world, that solve the problems, that massive problems that we have facing us, and the controversy between creating an app or tackling one of these big ideas. Do you think that we have enough innovation going on in this area?
Well, computer science has been amazingly successful in the last 20 years. It has created platforms for web development so that starting a web company is not high-tech anymore. It's almost anybody can develop a website. The art in the modern website is the business model, or it isn't the technology. It is not a technology company. And the internet is, even after all these, however many years it's been, 40-some years, is blossoming. So there are huge opportunities there, and no one can be blamed for pursuing them hotly. And with this platform, these platforms that are available now, mobile platforms, cloud, mobile, social, they're all there just waiting for brilliant thinkers to have ideas and competently execute them and start companies and be the next Mark Zuckerberg. And I'm not blaming you all for doing that. However, as I tell my students, I'm still getting used to having students, so excuse me for referring to them as my students. I tell them the world's big, important problems are not going to be solved with yet another website. So can we, think of some others? And of course, one of the problems is I'm focused on undergraduates, and undergraduates don't know much. So it's hard for them to develop high-tech companies for which there's much tech. So therefore, it's natural for them to gravitate toward web companies because those are doable. But developing a new solar wafer technology or a new energy storage technology or a new drug is not something that your average undergraduate can take on. So that's sort of an explanation for why we have so many web companies. But we're beginning to get some medical device companies into our own little startup world, and we had an isotope separation company last semester, so we're beginning to get non-web companies. Now, the greater Austin area, which of course includes San Antonio, has more than its share of people who know how to build websites. And I don't know where that exactly came from, but did it come from Trilogy, or did it come from, where did it come from? I don't know. But so you see a lot of that activity here, Silicon Valley here, Boston, all 3 are. So that leads people to say that silly thing that you said, which is that we lack imagination here in Central Texas. We just can't think of anything other than doing a website. And I think that's not fair. It's just there's a hell of a lot of opportunities in that area, and the people who inhabit this Central Texas area seem particularly good at that, so why not pursue it? But that eventually, you all are going to explore that space, and every nook and cranny of the web space will be explored, in which case then it'll be time to turn our attention to some of those other more pressing problems, like the three big ones: energy, education, and healthcare. Let's work on, now you can work on those with websites, by the way, but there's also non-website companies that need to be started in those three spaces.
And that I was going to ask you, if you were to tackle a big problem today as an entrepreneur, if you were just getting out of college, what would that be?
It would be energy or education or healthcare. And it's hard to choose. The one that's actually got me going recently is education. The University of Texas, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, they're all doomed. You saw what iTunes did to music, you saw what Amazon did to books, you saw what Google did to advertising and journalism. MOOCs are now going to slaughter conventional education. And this whole idea of lecturing 20 people with a whiteboard is not going to last. MOOCs, you all know what MOOCs are? Massively online open courseware. So my son, who lives in California, recent college graduate, he and I recently took MIT's Introduction to Computer Science and Programming course. 47,000 of us took that course at the same time. No, that's not the right number. I'm mixing my numbers up. 100,000 students took that course at the same. It was Python programming, so I'm now a Python programmer. I've been programming recently, now that I'm newly equipped. My son, by the way, said, "Dad, it's not fair. You have a PhD in computer science. It's not fair." And I said, "With Max, I took it. It's 40 years old and it's only from Harvard."